So today we'll start to talk about vintages.
Yep.
Of Bordeaux.
Vintages in Bordeaux. 2010 to today.
Yeah.
Or more or less. Well, yeah.
And that's a nice portion of time to divide it up into decades.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So we'll start off with the newest decade, 2010 to today.
Well, 2010 is first vintage we'll talk about, and it's one of the great ones. It's back when it was new. It was something some of the wine producers were almost a bit ashamed of, because they had already talked so nicely about, well, the wines were nice as well, about 2009. So we got two quite different but extremely good vintages side by side. It's not the first time that's happened, but 2010 is, well, now it's almost, well, close to 15 years on, but 2010 is really great vintage for sure. There's a few unusual wines. There's some wines with lots of alcohol, lots of power. So some wines are maybe not quite what you expect from Bordeaux, but there's also a lot of well, most wines are really, really excellent. There's a lot of tannins. It's a very tannic vintage, but unlike other tannic vintages, the tannins are extremely ripe. So it's some of the highest levels of tannins ever measured. But most wines, you don't really feel them that much, also because of the level of concentration in the fruit. Gorgeous vintage. There are some who feels it was maybe not quite as great as it was thought in the beginning, but I have to say that most 2010s I taste impress me quite a lot, even today.
And what would be your bar to say that a wine or a vintage is iconic?
Well, it has to be enough good to great wines. If you can, a great vintage is when sort of everyone is able to make a great wine. If you buy a wine which you haven't really heard of, or a wine which normally don't impress you that much, and you think it's better than the average from that place, or you think it's a very good wine in the first place, if you don't really know it, I think that's pretty good benchmark of a good vintage. Well, most wines needs to be good. There's vintages where some make really great wines, some areas, for example, but you had problems elsewhere, and so maybe left bank. Normally talk about left bank and right bank. I probably prefer the left bank in 2010, especially some in Saint-Emilion has some really big and massive wines, and not all of them are as graceful as at least some of us might want. But in general, I think 2010 is a brilliant vintage. I think there will be very long lasting, and I think that probably most of the wines which are not shining right now are not shining because they're in a phase where they just need more cellar time. I think the wines are still young. They're primary in the fruits. So they will age a long time, I'm quite sure. Then we have, at least from my point of view, underrated vintage, 2011. I always found 2011 to be better than most people claim. I think 2011 is a vintage that it's not a great vintage, but I think it's a very good vintage. I think prices are low. It's always good prices on 2011s. They're drinking really well right now. They also have very high levels of tannins. They were a bit boring for a while because everything was sort of just in a big lump. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's underrated, because for probably 6-7 years after the release, the wines didn't, or even more, almost 10 years, I think. The wines didn't really show that much. But today, I think it's a classic, very, very good vintage. High levels of, some of the highest levels of tannins ever measured. But again, very ripe, very elegant, from my point of view at least, wines, nice freshness. I really like 2011, and normally it's quite a bit cheaper than 2010, which I think is a good thing as well, because 2010s tends to be fairly expensive. Then we have a overrated, in my book, vintage 2012. I think the 2012s is. I've tasted lots of wines, hundreds of wines side by side, same Chateau 2011, 2012. Mainly because I didn't understand why people claim that 2012 was a better vintage, because I never felt it was. And 2012, in 99% of the cases, are lighter, leaner, thinner, but they show everything. And I think it's a much easier vintage to understand. But they lack a bit of concentration. The aftertaste tends to be fairly short. It's a little bit watered down in a way. So I think 2012 for me is fairly average vintage.
And what would you say is, obviously the climate has a lot to say when we talk about the difference between 2010, 11, 12 and so forth. The climates, and also very fascinating how complex the climate is throughout a season and how that decides how the wine becomes, like with temperatures and when you pick the grapes and everything. So what would you say is the reason why 2010 became a wine with a lot more potential than the other ones when it comes to the climate?
Well, it's a combination of everything that happened in the vineyard that year. From if the growing season is perfect, normally you get fairly perfect vintage as well. So the great vintages are normally not that difficult to describe. Everything just went really well in a vintage. Problematic vintages is, for example, you have vintages where things went perfect until September, when you're getting close to harvesting, and then it's pouring down with rain, diluting the grapes, and all of a sudden what could be excellence is then just average. Sometimes it's the opposite. All summer has been a bit too cold, a bit too rainy, and everybody thinks this is going to be shit. And September gets really warm and really dry, and just all of a sudden the concentration and the ripeness and everything goes quickly and perfectly. So there's not one thing which makes a great vintage. You can have very good vintages with very different growing seasons, with very different temperature. But one of the things which, for example, a lot of people think that frost will make a bad vintage. It doesn't have to. Frost can damage a lot, but frost can also take away some of the bunches, meaning that there will be more concentration in what's left, meaning that you normally have a more complex wine. The ripening gets quicker, so or can go quicker. So if the weather isn't perfect, you still probably get ripe bunches, meaning you get a better wine. So there's many things that can contribute to bad and good vintages. It's about getting what you need when you need it, in a way. So if it's, for example, if it's sunny all summer, it gets too dry. You start to get raisins, which is not a good thing. Whenever the plants get what they need when they need it, that's normally needed for a great vintage. But it's complex, so it's not there's not one answer to why one vintage is good.
And this is what's really fascinating to me about the whole process of making wines. It is that you can't compensate for these things. You have to let it be. Like if it's very warm and your grapes are about to dry out, just have to let it. You can't water the grapes or the plants. You have to.
Not in great vineyards. It's legal to irrigate. So yeah, you have to. At least in Europe. In the rest of the world, it's different. But
exactly, and that's what's really fascinating, and that is one of the key factors of what makes it so interesting when everything falls into place and you're actually able to make a great wine. Nature has really been on your team that year.
Yeah. Well, it's nature produces wine. I think the term natural wine is a very strange one, because all wines are natural. It's impossible to make a wine in laboratory. So all wines have grown in the vineyard. But of course, there are people who spray them to death and people who make all sorts of weird shit going on in the vineyards, in the winery, afterwards to be able to make something drinkable out of, not all grapes are equal. So some grapes are if you mass produce lots of yields, young plants, you don't make great wines. Poor soils, the wrong type of poor soils, because poor soils actually tend to make great wines. But if it's too much, wine plant is, this is growing fairly well, far away from vintages now, but it's, wine is a climber as a plant. So if it's too fertile in the soil, it will grow like crazy. It can grow 6, 7, 10 meters in a year. And that's what it wants to do. It wants to go up big trees. So what you need to do is to tame it. And that's one of the reasons why, as there's a saying that if your soil is too poor for growing anything, too poor even for olives, that's when you probably have a good terroir for wine plants. So some of the greatest vineyards on the planet is actually, you can't grow much else there. I remember seeing an interview with Corinne Menslopoulos from the owner of Chateau Margaux in Bordeaux. She was walking in when they had dug up one of their best plots. She was walking through it, and after 3 years, there was hardly any what you call it?
I don't remember
the weeds. The weeds, and there was hardly any. It looked like a parking spot, to be honest, because
really?
everything was just gravel and sand, and So
that's interesting.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the best, arguably probably the best places to grow wines on the planet, because Chateau Margaux isn't really that bad, So it's
not really that bad.
So soil is a big topic and extremely varied topic as well. If you're into plants, if you feed peonies too much, they will never have flowers. They will just become a massive big bush. So it's the same thing with lots of plants. It needs a certain amount of nutritions, but it's like us. You get lazy and big and fat if you get the wrong sort of and too much food. I'm not saying anything more than that.
Well, exactly.
Well, going back to vintages, which we're supposed to talk about, 2013 is a vintage where a lot of things went wrong. I think that's the vintage where everything went wrong, more or less. You had frost, you had mildew, you had hail, you had water, too much water. 2013 is very, very... those wines tends to be very thin. That's one of the really difficult vintages in the last 25 years. Probably the worst vintage in the last 25 years as well. So 2013 tends to be very light. Some of them are already past their prime on lower levels. Grand Cru Classés will always normally age at least 20 years, most of the time 25 years as well. But 2013 is not a vintage that you should fill your cellar with. And if you have some, pop the corks and drink them. 2014, much more classic vintage. I think it's I think the concentration tends to be a little bit, from my point of view, a little bit lower than the 2011s. But it's a very, very classic style. So it's a vintage. A lot of people, at least if you like the classic Bordeaux, the lower alcohol, the not so concentrated fruit, 2014 is probably a vintage you like very well. I like it as well. Actually, it's one of those vintages that has never sort of shut down. They've always been enjoyable, but now they're starting to get some development on them, which I think it takes about 10 years normally to get some secondary aromas in Bordeaux. So it's the next decade will be more interesting to drink them, I think, than they have been up to now. But a lot of people have already had a big share of their 2014s. 2015, that's a different animal. That's the first proper good vintage after 2010, where we really have nice, lovely fruit, more concentration, more aftertaste. I had an absolutely wonderful Braner du Cru 2015 last night. Still primary in the aromas, not much of development, but the tannins are getting softer. So with the short hour in the counter, that's starting to become a real charming wine now. And I think that's where the 2015s are heading now. That's we're getting into where they're nice to drink. I know that some like their wines much younger than I normally do, so a lot of people drink their wines earlier. But for me, what you really pay for in Bordeaux, Cabernet Sauvignon or Merlot, wherever it's from, is the secondary aromas. When you start to get the tobacco and the cigars, and when you start to see those things forming in the background, that's when I think that's when I know that these are some of the greatest wines on the planet. I think they're not really that charming when they're young. That's just a fruit bomb with quite a bit of tannins. That's my point of view. 2016 is a vintage I absolutely love. There's some say find 15 to be a better vintage than 16. I think that has to do with which layer are you in. 15s have more fruit, more concentration, often a bit higher alcohol. 16 is very classic, brighter fruit. So if you're more on the European palate, I think you prefer 16. If you're more on the US palate, you probably prefer 2015. But I think both of these vintages are really great, but with quite different personalities. 16 is one of my absolute favorite vintages in a long time. I think I just love the expression of the 2016. Another wine I had yesterday was Chateau La Rose, Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Classé, 2016 yesterday. It's also just getting into where you start to see more of the secondary aromas. I think it's absolutely brilliant wine to drink right now. But it will definitely age for another 15, 20 years. No problem whatsoever. This is where they start to get interesting. If you drank all your 2016s 5 years ago, I feel sorry for you, because this and if there's a vintage where I would love to have a palette of wine, not from one, but say 5 bottles of 100 different Bordeaux wines, that would be 2016 for sure. I absolutely love the expression of 2016.
So like you say, the secondary aromas is what's interesting, in your opinion, with Bordeaux?
Yes.
And what would...
not only in Bordeaux. I think the only red wine I really love with primary fruit is Pinot Noir. I think young Pinot Noir is as good as old Pinot Noir. It's one of the few varieties which I think is absolutely gorgeous its entire life, like Riesling, but that's white, of course, or Chardonnay. Chardonnay is good all the way through. I'm not saying that Bordeaux is not good when it's young. I just, what you're paying for is not really there yet. So you bought something which is expensive, and right now it doesn't feel that expensive, but it will feel very expensive in 10 years. If you've never had mature Bordeaux, you probably missed out on the greatest flavors in a wine on the planet. That doesn't mean that everybody likes old wines, because not everybody do, and that's a different story. But proper bottle of old Bordeaux, for me, that's probably the greatest wine you can get. That complexity is just incredible, that you can have all those different aromas. Is hugely fascinating. It's something completely different that fascinates with Pinot Noir. It's not the complexity, it's the lightness, it's the finesse, it's the subtleties, it's the brilliance of fruit. So it's a completely different thing that fascinates me with the Pinot Noir than Bordeaux. You pay fairly easily 50 to 100 or 200 euros for a bottle of excellent producer Bordeaux. It's not really that evident what you're paying for when you're buying or drinking it young. But it's the same if you buy a Sassicaia or Nelaya or something from Napa Valley. It's exactly the same, or top Cabernet from Penfolds. It doesn't matter where on the planet it's from. It needs at least 10 years normally to have more of the complexity which will normally come. If I could choose freely, I would have probably only had wines from the 80s and older every day. I mean, I understand that not everyone likes wines when they're properly old, like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, or even the 20s. I think that when those wines hit, it's absolutely stunning, wonderful experience. And those are the really great wine moments nearly always. But I love also wines when they're in that, when you really have the secondary aromas and tertiary aromas, but you still have the youthful fruit, meaning in most Bordeaux, we are probably talking vintages today like 95, 96, late 90s, 2001, 2000, sort of that sort of age, 20 to 25 years. They're actually more 25 to 30 now. But around 20 years is when top estates really start to shine normally. So 2005 is that's 20 years. That's a vintage which is still quite hard. It's very tannic. I think, well, we're going to talk about 2005 later on, but that's a vintage which, like 86, they just feel much younger than they are. But the vintage like 2000 and 2001 today, I think they're really hitting the spot. They're wonderful right now, but they will still age easily another 15, 20, 25 years, depending on the winery, and some probably even more. Sort of that age is where I think you're getting really everything you paid for. But you also get that if you age them even further. So drinking 82, 85, 86, 89, now is gorgeous wines, and of course they are already, 82 is nearly twice as old as a 2001. So
well, let's talk about that when we talk about these vintages.
So, yeah,
the thing is, like,
we have to further on these vintages.
My impression is that with producers, their focus is always telling the story of the vintage and with the climate in focus. So when you say that 2016 is your favorite vintage, or like a really good vintage for you, what kind of climate is that?
The classic style will come if the vintage is not too warm. So in this episode, it will be the one after 2017. So let's just do 2017 first. Yeah. 2017 was very, very difficult vintage. It's not 2013 difficult, but we had lots of frost. I remember bringing a group 2 weeks after the frost to Bordeaux. We sat at Terrasse Rouge, which is a restaurant at La Dominique, meaning you're watching over the vineyards between, well, you're in Saint-Emilion, but a few hundred meters away, you have Pomerol, and you have a slight indentation in the vineyard, and all of that lower part was brown because of frost, because frost goes down, and all the lower parts were dead. And you had vineyards where everything was gone. There was wineries who lost everything that vintage because of frost. And you have some super unusual wines in some places because they lost all their Merlot. So all of a sudden they're a right bank wine vineyard who's made everything from Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc, if they had both of those varieties, meaning it's a very different wine from what you expect from that estate. So when you lose one of your key varietals, it could also be that you lost Cabernet Sauvignon, but whatever you do, you have some wineries which made a very atypical wine from the property. So some lost everything from a variety, some lost parts, meaning that maybe they lost 60%, meaning that what they had left of that variety got incredibly ripe. So you have some exceptionally high alcohol wines. So some people lost everything. Some people lost 95% or 99%, so they made just some tiny quantities. And then you have some who made some really unusual wines with massive alcohol, which you don't expect in a vintage like 2017. But those who didn't have such a drastic issue in their vineyards made some quite elegant classic wines. So there are some absolutely charming, lovely wines in 2017 as well, but you have to sort of know. It's not a carte blanche vintage. You have to know if the producer had, not only probably luck on as well. But it's a vintage where you also see how good people are if they know their stuff. I don't think it's not a great vintage in Bordeaux, but it's a good vintage. The best wines would probably be on par with 2014 in my book. Then we have 2018, which is one of the warmest. And that's the thing. When you have a really, really warm vintage, meaning acidity goes down, acidity is one of the preservatives in a wine. So when pH levels and acidity goes below a certain point, they age quicker. Again, it's a vintage we'll talk about in the next episode, but 2003 was a really warm vintage. And if you tasted 2002, 2003, and 2004 from the same estate today, 2003 tends to taste 10 years older than the others. And if you also joined a 2005 in there, the 2005 would probably taste between 6 and 10 years younger than the rest. So some vintages age very slowly and others quicker. And pH and tannin levels and concentration are parts of, it's very complex. We don't really know exactly what happens when a wine ages. Science have gotten us to a point, but there's a lot in the wine industry we still don't know. And maybe some say maybe it's best to leave those things as a mystery, because honestly we don't really always know. And even if we in the industry are fairly good at predicting vintages and what will happen with aging, there's still some surprises. There's vintages coming which felt like they were not supposed to age as well as they turned out to do. And there's vintages where everybody thought, oh, these will age fantastically, and they age quicker. So there's no one answer to anything in wine, which it's never boring. You always learn something new. So 2018 is a vintage, unusual vintage. It's definitely a big, good, maybe even a great vintage. But I always say to my readers and my clients that you have to check if you like it, because it's unusual. It's hardly any vintage which is similar in Bordeaux. Not like 16 or 19, which are much more classic in style, where if you like Bordeaux, you will love these vintages, as you will probably love 2015. 2018 is a different animal. So 2018, you need to know that you love that style of wine. I'm not the biggest fan myself. I think there's too much alcohol, a little bit too lazy acidity. It's not my cup of tea, but I know a lot of journalists, I know a lot of wine collectors absolutely love this vintage. So yeah, there we go. There's and wineries, winemakers as well.
Why is that, would you say? What would
it's different. Why do some people buy Audi and some people buy Mercedes? You prefer two different things. It's as simple as that. I also think that in general, what we see is that American consumers tends to like sweeter, bolder, richer vintages. But that's probably also because the wines they make themselves are bigger, bolder, and sweeter than what we do here. Because the thing is that when you're a winemaker and you're in Europe, you have the winery that's always been there. Oh, well, not always, but most of them have been there for centuries. So if you inherit a property, that's where it's always been, and you have to do something about it. While if you're investing tens of millions of euros into a new winery in the US or in Australia, you're not going to take the chances. So you're going to grow those wines in a somewhat warmer climate, because you don't want to have the risk of having problems with ripeness every third year, meaning that you probably lose money every third year. That's not a good business idea, meaning that you do the vineyards 200 meters further down the slope where it's warmer, much safer, but that also sometimes makes the wine less delicate, and you don't have the same differences in vintages as we do in the classic old vineyards. So, for example, I got a question yesterday when I had a wine course. Why don't anyone make truly excellent Riesling outside of Europe. And Riesling is one of those grape varieties where the closer it's, at least from my point of view, it seems to be the closer you get to its coldest limit, the more exciting it gets. If you have a Riesling from the Mosel, it's absolutely brilliant. There's nothing else on the planet, which, not even in Germany, which has that brilliant, bright freshness as a Mosel Riesling has. And I don't think anyone would be mad enough to plant it in such a similar, because there's definitely a valley somewhere in the States, or maybe in Canada, or Tasmania or whatever, which should have climate similar to Mosel. It must be. But doing an investment where you don't have to take that chance. If you inherit a vineyard in Mosel, that's where you are, so you're stuck with it. But if you're investing, because it's really expensive to make a winery, so you can't. Nobody in their right mind would do that, and that's probably why we don't really have these fantastic Rieslings anywhere else, and I think that's why. Because the potential should be there somewhere, but nobody dares to take that chance.
You're really making the case for yet another reason to be fascinated by the old world, because it's based on the traditions, and they're, as you say, they're kind of stuck.
Yeah, they are.
The wineries, and they have to make the best
for
out
better
of it. And
the
result of that is wines that are so refined.
Another thing which is fascinating, now we're not talking about vintages again, but another thing which always fascinates me is that if you're in Bordeaux and you want to taste Pinot Noir, it's a 6 hours drive between Bordeaux and Beaune, which makes the microclimate quite different. While if you're in love with Pinot Noir and Cabernet Sauvignon in Italy or in California, you have those vineyards side by side, or a few kilometers away up the slope. So it's very close by, meaning that there's. I know some will be furious about this, but I think everywhere in Europe you have to drive for quite a bit to get to another variety. Probably the two closest are Pinot Noir, and you then have Gamay in the middle in Beaujolais, and then you have Syrah on each side of Lyon. But going from a great Pinot Noir vineyard to Côte-Rôtie is still, how long is that? 1 hour, 20 minutes or so on the highway. So it's still not side by side in the same vineyard. While most of the time you have to change countries. If you want a great Tempranillo, you have to go to Rioja or Ribera del Duero. If you want Sangiovese, you have to go all the way down to Tuscany. If you want Nebbiolo, you have to go to Piedmont. So not that people have been really successful with these Italian varieties, at least not Nebbiolo, Barbera, and Sangiovese elsewhere. Those varieties seems to be clinging to themselves in the area where they're from. But in Europe, you normally have to travel for hours in the car to get from one variety, domination of one variety to the domination of another variety. While in the rest of the world, someone who tends to be a billionaire just loves Riesling and loves Syrah and have them side by side in the vineyard, even if no one in the right minds in Europe would ever put those two varieties side by side. It will probably also be legal in most cases. So...
And I have to make one comment when it comes to talking about the theme of the episode, vintages. And so when it comes to, the diversions that we make here, the thing is, in the wine world and in the world of good wines, there's way too much to talk about anyways. So we're gonna be off theme in some way.
And just to make it clear, I love wines from the New World, so it has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, they're great.
But I absolutely love great. I care about great wines. I don't really care where they're made. But I'm pretty convinced that it would be super difficult to make a absolutely first-rate Cabernet Sauvignon or Bordeaux blend wine and a top-notch Riesling within 4 kilometers from each other. I'm pretty convinced that would be quite impossible. I don't think it's a good idea to have Pinot Noir next to Cabernet Sauvignon either. They want different climates. So I'm not saying that there's people who has it, who makes really great wines anyway. So yes, it's possible in a way, but as a business plan, that's not what I would plan. I would rather do 2 different wineries in 2 very different locations if I wanted to make really exceptional Pinot Noir and a really exceptional Bordeaux blend. But now we're way off topic again.
We can talk about this later, because
we can talk about everything for ages and ages and ages.
Exactly, because it's very interesting that, and the traditions and the methods, because you also blend different grape varieties in other newer countries, like in the New World. So there's so much other stuff going on there.
That's another thing where you have some blends now appearing where you wouldn't really think about doing those blends. Well, I guess I might be wrong, but I guess the first ones who really did some strange from European perspective blends was when Australians started with the Shiraz and Merlot and Shiraz and Cabernet blends. That would be, well, the French actually did that in the 17th, 18th century or somewhere around there, where they took underripe Bordeaux and blended it with Hermitage. They Hermitaged it. They probably did the same in Burgundy. We don't know exactly when they stopped, but that's sort of the birth of appellation system, where you couldn't bring in varieties or wine to boost the alcohol and fruit. We're off topic again.
Yeah, this is a big topic.
Back to vintages. But we need to figure out how to put that into probably more than one episode as well.
For sure.
But where were we? We were 2019. 2019 is very, again, quite classical vintage. It's a bit richer than 2016, but those 2 are sort of, in my book, a bit like brothers. They're in the same sort of mold, but 2019s are a little bit richer. I slightly prefer 2016. But those 2 vintages for me in the last decade are absolutely stunning. 2020, warmer. It's sort of in between 19. It has more of the freshness of 19, but it has more of the ripeness of 2018. So it's somewhere in the middle there. These 3 vintages, wine geeks, wine producers, wine journalists, we're going to discuss which is our favorite vintage, which are the favorite vintage of the general idea about these 3 vintages. That will be discussed for the next 20, 30, 40 years for sure. So we're definitely having some great vintages. Who likes which vintages the most will differ from person to person. 21, that's much more difficult. That's I remember during Primeur and after tasting quite a few hundred of these 21s this winter as well, I sort of stick with my old term. It's sort of a modern 1988. 88 might be slightly better vintage. Maybe. It's a bit difficult to I haven't really had a 21 and 88 from the same chateau side by side, because it's more the expression of the vintage than, I don't know if the concentration levels would be the same and the length of the aftertaste. 88 is vintage which always has a slightly bit of green herbal note to it. I think most 21s have this slight green herbal note to it. It's a very classic but a little bit leaner vintage, that's also how I find 1988 in a blind tasting. It's an old style vintage, made much more precisely, of course, because the winemaking skills today are completely different from what they used to be. So it's much more precise. The precision in the wines in the last 10 years or 15 years are completely different. Today, even 2010 feels a little bit old-fashioned in winemaking compared to a new vintage. The precision in a wine today is just incredible. But so 21 is a difficult vintage. A lot of people will find quite a lot of these wines lean and skinny and thin and green, for sure. So I think to really appreciate its vintage, I think you really need to like the style of wine which only Bordeaux makes. Nobody else makes wines like that elsewhere in where they make Bordeaux blends. So that's a very Bordelais style, but it's a leaner vintage for sure. 22 is that's a bit of a strange vintage. Quite a bit of heat. There was problems with drought, and yet the wines now. I had difficulties with 22 during Primeur. I thought that wine was a bit like 2018. I thought the wines were quite jammy, quite sweet, quite big, but they had acidity. 2 years later, 1.5 years later, I think the wines are much more classic than I thought they would become, maybe ever. So they lost that sweet baby fat, as we call it, and they turn much more classic in style. Some of them have a bit high alcohol, but most of them hide it very well. And the acidity is great, giving a fantastic brightness to very concentrated fruit. So 22 has turned from, after Primeur, I was not quite sure how well I liked it. I know some already claimed it one of the greatest vintages ever. I thought that was a bold statement, but I'm much more happy with it now than I was. I'm not sure if I think it's much greater than 2019 or 2016. Well, there's different personalities. Again, do you like Mercedes? Do you like BMW? Do you like Audi? It's just different expressions of similar or high quality wines. Yeah, then we have 23, which was quite difficult again. Not super exciting. There's so many exciting vintages now that 21, 23 is probably two vintages that you don't really have to buy. There's too many exciting vintages in the market. I haven't tasted 24 yet, so I don't know. But 23 in general is probably not the most important vintage to buy. There's some good ones. There's always some good ones, but yeah. It's not a vintage I'm going to fill my cellar with. And I think that goes for 21 as well.
So this will for sure be dated, but as of right now, you're actually going to Bordeaux.
Yeah,
this is April of 25, so you're going there to taste the 24 in the Primeur.
Yeah, next week.
So that's exciting.
Yeah, well, it is. The producers always sort of raise the expectations, but I was in Bordeaux most of January, and I was also in Bordeaux quite a lot last autumn. And in September and October, there was not many smiles. I had some lunches with some winemakers when they were having their harvesting lunches with they finished the harvest, and everyone was just tired, and everyone was, oh God, so much work, so much trouble in the vintage, and the wines are probably going to be shit. I was very pessimistic, to be honest. While when I came back in January, when the wines had fermented, nearly everyone said, you're going to have some surprises during Primeur. And some journalists have already arrived, and the first very few comments I've seen are more optimistic than I thought they would be. I've just seen one or two comments, but it's early days. Primeur actually starts in 2 weeks, so I'll go down almost a week before it starts because there's too many wines to taste for just 1 week. So yeah.
And we'll talk about that for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Might not be that much to see, to be honest. So that was the vintages 2010 to 2023.
Yep.
With a hint of 24.
That was very wine-ish said of you.